The stray who brought a secret. The first time Claire Holloway saw the scruffy golden-coated stray, she assumed he was just another forgotten dog wandering through town. He had been lingering around her neighborhood for weeks, keeping his distance but never straying too far. She had left food out for him a few times, never getting too close. She figured he was waiting to trust her. But today was different. The dog wasn't just lingering anymore. He was coming straight for her. And this time, he had something in his mouth. The object he carried. Claire was sitting on her porch, sipping her evening coffee when she saw the dog trotting up her driveway. His tail wagged excitedly, his golden fur matted with dirt. But what caught her attention wasn't the dog. It was the object clutched between his jaws. At first, she thought it was a stick. But as he got closer, the object caught the fading sunlight, glinting in a way wood never would. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She set her coffee down carefully and stood. "Hey, buddy," she called gently, trying not to startle him. "What do you have there?" The dog stopped a few feet away, his tail still wagging. Then, very deliberately, he set the object down on her porch. He looked up at her, his tongue lolling out as if proud of his find. Claire hesitated before stepping forward. Her stomach tightened when she saw it up close. It wasn't a stick. It was a bone, and it didn't look like it had come from an animal. A growing sense of dread. Claire's fingers tingled as she crouched down, hesitating before reaching for the object. She had seen bones before. Growing up in the countryside, she had come across plenty. But this one was different. It was bleached by the elements, weathered but intact. The shape was oddly precise, the ridges and indentations too clean-cut to belong to a deer or a stray animal. Her stomach twisted. She swallowed hard. "Where did you get this, boy?" she murmured. The dog wagged his tail and gave a soft huff, watching her expectantly. It was as if he was waiting for her reaction. Claire's first instinct was to brush it off. Dogs found bones all the time, right? But something deep inside her gut told her this wasn't just any bone. She needed a second opinion. Her first thought was Dr. Howard, the town's veterinarian. He had a sharp eye for detail, and if anyone could tell her whether she was overreacting, it was him. Claire sighed, running a hand through her hair. "All right, buddy. Let's go see what the doc thinks." The dog perked up immediately, falling into step beside her as she grabbed her car keys. He wanted her to figure this out. And for the first time, Claire wondered, what else had he found? The vet's reaction. The short drive to Holloway Veterinary Clinic was eerily quiet. The dog sat in the passenger seat, his golden fur catching the last light of the day. Claire stole glances at him between turns, feeling a strange sense of companionship settle over her. He had chosen to bring this to her. That had to mean something. When she pulled up to the small brick building, she spotted Dr. Howard locking up for the night. The older man turned at the sound of her tires crunching against the gravel, giving her a curious look. "Claire, what brings you by so late?" She stepped out, holding up the bone. "I think I found something strange." Dr. Howard's gaze flicked to the object in her hands. His easygoing expression shifted instantly. He took a slow step forward. "Mind if I take a look?" Claire handed it over, watching as the vet turned it carefully in his hands. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with something she couldn't quite place, something close to concern. After a long pause, he exhaled. "Claire," he said, voice measured, "this isn't just any bone." A chill skated down her spine. "What do you mean?" Dr. Howard looked at her, then at the stray dog, who was still watching them with quiet interest. "This." The vet turned the bone in the light again. "This looks human." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Claire's mouth went dry. "You're sure?" "I'm not a forensic expert," he admitted, his voice calm but firm. "But I've seen plenty of bones in my time. And this one, it's not from any animal I've treated." Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned to look at the dog, who sat beside her patiently. Her stomach churned with an unsettling realization. He had brought her a human bone. What now? So what do we do? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Howard hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "We call the authorities, and we find out where he got this." The words settled heavy in the air between them. Claire exhaled slowly, glancing at the dog again. He had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to listen. And for the first time she wondered, what else did he know? The dog who knew too much. The words, "This looks human," still echoed in Claire Holloway's mind as she drove back home. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Her heart was still racing from Dr. Howard's revelation. The stray dog sat beside her in the passenger seat, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. The streetlights flickered past them, illuminating his muddy fur and alert posture. For the first time, Claire wasn't just looking at him as a lost dog. She was looking at him as something more. A messenger, a guide, maybe even a witness. Because if he had found one human bone, there was a terrifying possibility that there were more. The sheriff's arrival. When Claire pulled into her driveway, she didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and dialed the Holloway Sheriff's Department. The line rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered. "Holloway Sheriff's Department. This is Deputy Miller." Claire swallowed hard. "Miller, it's Claire. I need you to come out to my property. Now." A brief pause. "Claire, what's going on?" She hesitated, glancing at the dog, who had already hopped out of the car and was sniffing the cool night air. "I think I found something," she finally said. Or rather, he did. Another pause. Then Miller's voice turned serious. "Stay put. I'll be there in 10. Claire ended the call, shoving her phone into her jacket pocket. The dog was still sniffing, his ears twitching toward the woods. As if he was waiting for her to follow him. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't sure she was ready for whatever came next. But she had a feeling that, ready or not, she was about to find out. The dog's trail. The wind was crisp as Claire walked toward the edge of her property, the stray dog trotting ahead of her. His tail was stiff but not raised, his ears flicking back every few moments, as if checking to make sure she was still behind him. "Where are you leading me, boy?" she muttered under her breath. The dog didn't respond, of course, but he moved with purpose. Claire had never followed him before. He had always been the one trailing her, lingering near her porch or watching her from a distance. But now, for the first time, it felt like he was in charge. And she was the one being led. The discovery in the woods. The dog led her toward the wooded area behind her house, where the trees grew thick and the air smelled of damp earth. Claire hesitated at the tree line. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She had walked through these woods plenty of times. But now, under the weight of what she knew, of what the dog had already found, they felt different. The dog paused. He sniffed the ground. Then, without warning, he started digging. Claire's pulse spiked. The sight of him clawing at the dirt made her breath catch. She didn't want to get closer, but she forced herself to. She dropped to her knees beside him and hesitated only for a moment before digging too. The soil was damp, cool against her fingertips. She dug deeper, and then her fingers brushed against something hard. A shape. Smooth. Curved. Her stomach turned. Her heart pounded. Another bone. Larger than the last one. And this time, it wasn't alone. Claire felt a sharp, panicked breath leave her lungs. The dog sat back on his haunches, panting softly, watching her as if he already knew what she had found. Claire swallowed hard. She reached for her phone with shaking hands and dialed Miller again. When he answered, she didn't waste any time. "Miller," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "There's more." The investigation begins. The crunch of tires on gravel signaled Deputy Miller's arrival. Claire stood at the edge of the woods, arms crossed tightly against the chill in the air. The dog sat beside her, his golden fur slightly ruffled by the breeze. Miller stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approached. His expression was unreadable, but his sharp eyes flicked from Claire to the dog, and finally to the woods behind her. "All right," he said, his voice calm but serious. "Tell me what we're looking at." Claire inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She led him to the disturbed patch of earth. Miller crouched down, pulling on a pair of gloves. He reached into the dirt and carefully lifted the partially unearthed bones. His jaw tightened. He turned them over in his hands. His face darkened. Claire didn't need him to say it. She already knew. "These bones," Miller said finally, "aren't from an animal." Claire felt her breath catch. Miller exhaled, standing up. He pulled out his radio. "I need forensic support out at Holloway property," he said into the receiver. "We've got something." His tone was professional, controlled, but Claire could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a stray dog bringing home something random. This was something bigger, something no one was ready for. The dogs passed. Miller turned to Claire. "You said the dog brought you the first bone." She nodded. "He brought it straight to my doorstep, like he was trying to tell me something." Miller studied the stray. The dog stared back, unwavering. Miller frowned. "You ever wonder where he came from?" Claire hesitated. She looked at the dog again, really looked at him. She had assumed he was just another lost pet. But now, she wasn't so sure. Miller sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll run a check to see if anyone's reported a missing dog matching his description. If he belonged to someone." He trailed off, his expression darkening. "If he belonged to someone." Claire finished. "Maybe that someone is connected to this." Miller nodded. "Exactly." The words settled heavy in the air. Claire felt a lump in her throat. She looked down at the dog, who was still watching the woods. His ears twitched. His body was still tense, as if he was saying, "This isn't over yet." The truth beneath the earth. The air around Claire Holloway felt heavier than it ever had before. The hum of conversation between Deputy Miller and the forensic team barely registered in her ears. Her eyes were locked on the dog. The stray, who had once been nothing more than a wandering soul in search of kindness, had led her here. To this moment. To the truth. And now, as the forensic team carefully unearthed more remains from the woods behind her house, the dog sat calmly beside her, as if he had known all along. The final discovery. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the small rusted lockbox that had just been pulled from the dirt. It had been buried deep beneath the roots of an old oak tree, along with the bones. The forensics officer wiped off the dirt and pried it open. Inside were letters. Yellowed, faded, yet somehow still intact. Miller pulled on a pair of gloves before carefully lifting them out. His jaw tightened as he unfolded the first piece of paper. He began reading. Claire's chest tightened as his expression shifted from confusion to understanding, to pure horror. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do they say?" Miller exhaled slowly. He turned the letter so she could see. The handwriting was delicate, but the words were anything but. "If someone finds this, please don't believe what they say. I was never supposed to disappear, but I know too much. I try to run. I think someone is watching me. If I don't make it out, please, please tell my family the truth." It was signed with a single name. Lillian Carter. A cold rush of realization swept over Claire. The missing woman. The one who had vanished decades ago. The woman no one ever found. Until now. The dog's secret past. The silence stretched. Claire turned toward the dog. He was staring at the letter, his head slightly tilted, his ears twitching. A deep ache settled in her chest. Could he have belonged to her? She whispered. Miller was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. It's possible. Claire looked back at the dog, feeling something unspoken pass between them. Had he been searching all this time? Had he been waiting, hoping, for someone to find the truth? Tears pricked at her eyes, because somehow she knew he had never really been lost. He had been waiting for the right person, waiting for her. Justice, finally. Days passed in a blur of investigation. The remains were officially identified. The town was shaken by the news that Lillian Carter's case, once considered unsolvable, had finally been brought to light. And it was all because of a stray dog. A dog who refused to forget. A dog who refused to give up. Authorities were able to trace old records and uncover a connection, one that pointed directly to a long-deceased suspect who had once lived in the area. The truth had been buried for decades. But now, because of one loyal soul, it had finally come to light. A new beginning. The news spread fast. People began to ask about the dog, where he came from, who he had belonged to. But Claire already knew the answer. He belonged nowhere. And yet, he had found his home. With her. So, on the morning after the case was finally closed, Claire did the only thing that felt right. She knelt beside him, scratched behind his ears, and said softly, "How do you feel about staying?" The dog looked up at her, his tail wagging slowly, as if to say, "I was always meant to be here." Claire smiled. "All right then, buddy. Welcome home." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the dog laid his head on her lap, let out a soft content sigh, and finally rested. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.